Greetings, everyone. My name is Thomas, and I am going to share with you some things about the revised Badí calendar, which is the calendar used by the Baha'i community around the world. I will share a presentation. So, what we're going to look at is the message from the Universal House of Justice dated 10th of July 2014, which defines the revision of the calendar. We'll have a look at the calendar with an overview. We'll look at the background and its origins. We'll look at the names used in the calendar and where those names come from. And then we'll look at the calendar itself. So we have the days of the week, we have months or of the year or days of the month, and the meaning of them and their placement in the calendar. We'll look at the 19-year cycle. That's yet another distinction. And we'll look at holy days within the calendar, appreciate a little bit about the meaning of sacred moments and place in time and space and rhythm of life recast that the House of Justice says in their message. And then for those who are not of the faint of heart, we'll look at some details about the path of the Earth's motion around the sun and the equinoxes, and look at understanding some of the guidance from the House of Justice that enables us to calculate the calendar. And then we will step through an example of determining a whole calendar year and picking the year 178 as an example, which is actually the year that we're in right now, at least at the time I'm making this video. And then at the end, we'll look at dates provided officially by the Universal House of Justice. So let's embark on this journey. From the message of the House of Justice. Dearly loved friends, the setting of the sun on 20th March 2015 will signalize the end of the year 171, the close of the 9th Vahed of the first Kolishe of the Baha'i era. We call upon the Baha'is of the East and West to adopt on that auspicious occasion the provisions that will unite them in the common implementation of the Badí calendar. In keeping with the principle governing the gradual unfoldment and progressive application of the teachings, the provisions of the Badí calendar have been set forth over time. The Bab introduced the calendar and its broad pattern of periods and cycles, months and days. Baha'u'llah provided essential clarifications and additions. Aspects were elucidated by Abdu'l-Baha, and arrangements for its adoption in the West were put in place at the direction of Shoghi Effendi, as described in the volumes of the Baha'i World. Still, ambiguities surrounding some Islamic and Gregorian dates, as well as difficulties in the correlation of historical observances and astronomical events with explicit statements in the text, left certain issues unresolved. When responding to questions concerning the calendar, both Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi left these matters to the Universal House of Justice. Of its many features, 3 require clarification for the calendar's uniform application: the means for the determination of Nowruz, the accommodation of the lunar character of the twin holy birthdays within the solar year, and the fixing of the dates of the holy days within the Badí calendar. The festival of Nowruz falleth on the day that the sun entereth the sign of Aries, Baha'u'llah explains in his most holy book. Even should this occur no more than 1 minute before sunset. However, details have until now been left undefined. We have decided that Tehran, the birthplace of the Abha beauty, will be the spot on the Earth that will serve as the standard for determining, by means of astronomical computations from reliable sources, the moment of the vernal equinox in the Northern Hemisphere, and thereby the day of Nowruz for the Baha'i world. The festivals of the twin birthdays, the birth of the Bab and the birth of Baha'u'llah, have, in the East, been traditionally observed according to their correspondence to the first and second days of Muharram in the Islamic calendar. These 2 days are accounted as one in the sight of God, Baha'u'llah affirms. Yet, a letter written on behalf of the Guardian states, in the future, no doubt all of the holy days will follow the solar calendar, and provisions be made as to how the twin festivals will be celebrated universally. How to satisfy the intrinsic lunar character of these blessed days within the context of a solar calendar has hitherto been unanswered. We have decided that they will now be observed on the first and the second day following the occurrence of the 8th new moon after Nowruz, as determined in advance by astronomical tables using Tehran as the point of reference. This will result in the observance of the twin birthdays moving year to year within the months of Mashiat Ilm and Kodrat of the Badí calendar, or from mid-October to mid-November, according to the Gregorian calendar. Next year, the birth of the Bab will occur on 10th Kodrat and the birth of Baha'u'llah on 11th Kodrat. With joy and eager anticipation, we look to the upcoming bicentennial anniversaries of the birth of Baha'u'llah and the birth of the Bab in 174 and 176 Baha'i era, respectively, which the entire Baha'i world will celebrate according to a common calendar. The dates of the remaining holy days will be fixed within the solar calendar in accordance with explicit statements of Baha'u'llah, Abdu'l-Baha, and Shoghi Effendi. We have decided to set aside certain discrepancies in the historical record. The dates are Nowruz, 1st of Baha, the festival of Rizwan, 13th Jalal to 5th Jamal, the declaration of the Bab, 8th Azamat, the ascension of Baha'u'llah, 13th Azamat, the martyrdom of the Bab, 17th Rahmat, the Day of the Covenant, 4th Qal, and the ascension of Abdu'l-Baha, 6th Qal. Unless specifically abrogated by these new provisions, previous guidance and clarifications pertaining to the calendar and the observance of the 19-day feast and holy days remain binding, such as the beginning of the day at sunset, the suspension of work, and the hours at which certain holy days are commemorated. In future, a change in circumstances may well require additional measures. It will be evident from the decisions delineated that Baha'is of both East and West will find some elements of the calendar to be different from those to which they have been accustomed. The alignment of the dates of the Badí calendar with other calendars will shift depending on the occurrence of Nowruz. The number of days of Ayamaha will vary according to the timing of the vernal equinox in successive years. The year commencing on Nowruz 172 Baha'i era will include 4 such days. A table prepared at the Baha'i World Center that sets out the dates for Nowruz and the twin holy birthdays, covering half a century, will be provided to all national spiritual assemblies in due course. The adoption of a new calendar in each dispensation is a symbol of the power of divine revelation to reshape human perception of material, social, and spiritual reality. Through it, sacred moments are distinguished, humanity's place in time and space reimagined, and the rhythm of life recast. Next Nowruz will mark yet another historic step into the manifestation of the unity of the people of Baha and the unfoldment of Baha'u'llah's world order. And that's signed to the Universal House of Justice. So at the bottom of the page, I have a link where you can get this exact message that we just read, in case you don't already have it. So this page is a little bit fanciful, but it made me wonder if I was the one who had to set the calendar, or you or any of us, right? The things that we might consider in doing it. And so this little table shows some of the possibilities that could have been considered, but the Bab, of course, chose the very bottom row of this table, 19 months of 19 days per month and 4 or 5 intercalary days to make out the full solar year. And these choices establish a rhythm of community life. It sets the frequency of how often the community gathers together at feast, right? Once in these 19 days. And it dedicates time for extra service or other considerations. And so it's really just a wonder. And speaking of wonder, in looking at an overview of the Badí calendar, we note that the word Badí means wondrous or simultaneously unique or beginning. So the calendar is solar. It flawlessly synchronizes with the Earth's movement around the sun, yet it incorporates elements of lunar calendar heritage. We have 19 months of 19 days plus 4 or 5 intercalary days. The new year begins at the vernal equinox, and that equinox is established on a particular day, adjusted according to the formula. Each new day begins at sunset. Each month and day is named after certain attributes of God. And if you doubt that statement, you can look at note 147 towards the end of the Kitabi Akdas. The calendar also has a 7-day week, each named after attributes of God, likewise. And each cycle of 19 years is called a Vahed, meaning unity, which is symbolic of the unity of God. And it has an Arabic abjad value of 19. 19 cycles of 19 years is called Kulashe, meaning all things. And that has a abjad value of 361, which is the number of days comprising the 19 times 19 uh, days of the calendar, and also 19 times 19 years for the cycle of 361 years. So a little bit of background. So the Bab originated the Badí calendar. He included this in the Kitab-e Asma, which is the Book of Names, somewhere around the years 1847 to 1850, and also in the Persian Bayan in late 1847 or early 1848. And he left it to the good pleasure of Baha'u'llah to either use it or discard it. Baha'u'llah confirmed and elaborated upon the calendar. He instructed Nabil to write an overview of the Badí calendar, and you can see the product of this work in the Baha'i World, Volume 8, Part 4, Section number 8. Baha'u'llah designated the first Baha'i year to have begun in the year of the declaration of the Bab, which in the Islamic calendar was 1260 and obviously 1844 in the Gregorian calendar. And the Kitab-e Akdas, which was revealed in 1873, Baha'u'llah made Nowruz the first day of the year. He positioned the intercalary days immediately preceding the last month, set Nowruz as the day of the vernal equinox, left the location for its determination up to the Universal House of Justice. And so from this, I personally infer that the first Baha'i year began or would have begun on the 20th of March, 1844, if we retroactively apply this new methodology of determining the actual Nowruz. And so that would have been the day 1, month 1, and year 1 of the Baha'i era. So in the revision that is provided in the 10th of July 2014 message of the House of Justice. So just to summarize, they announced a common implementation of the calendar that would apply worldwide, beginning at sunset, 20th of March 2015, selected Tehran as the reference point for computing the calendar, and clarified in personal communication to yours truly when I raised questions about how to properly compute the calendar, that the international GPS coordinate of Tehran was to be used and not any specific Baha'i landmark. And also they established a solar-lunar determination of the twin birthdays, birth of Baha'u'llah and the birth of the Bab, and indeed established exactly where the holy days would occur in accordance with the revised Badí calendar. So prior to this, holy days were fixed, observed differently within East and West, So the twin birthdays were celebrated according to the lunar calendar in the East and the Holy Land. And elsewhere, they were um, celebrated according to the Gregorian dates. The months and holy days had a fixed relationship in the Gregorian calendar. There were 4 intercalary days in a regular year and 5 in a leap year. But now there is full independence from any man-made calendars of the past, a further assertion of the independent nature of the new revelation and further steps towards the unification of the world. So where do the names come from that are used in the calendar? The names of the months, the names of the days. Well, in the Kitabi Asma, the Bab honored the dawn prayer revealed by the 5th Imam for Ramadan, the Islamic fast. And so the Bab honored this work by incorporating some of its names into his book of names and thus into the Badí calendar. So it would not be appropriate to say that these names come from the prayer. The names come from the revelation of the Bab and his choices. You can read the full translation of this dawn prayer at this link that I have on the page. This is translated by Stephen Lambden, and I'm showing you here verses 1 and 2 out of the 22, just to give you a feel of the beauty of this prayer. O my God, I beseech thee by thy Baha at its most splendid, for all thy splendor is truly resplendent. I verily, O my God, beseech thee by the fullness of thy splendor. O my God, I beseech thee by thy Jamal at its most beautiful, for all thy beauty is truly beauteous. I verily, O my God, beseech thee by the whole of thy beauty. My Arabic friends, or some of my Arabic friends, actually use this prayer during the Baha'i fast, and I'm told that it's so moving that it brings them to tears. The English version, I think, has the same effect. So the names come from the Kitabi Asma, so it might be useful to understand or appreciate a little bit about this particular work. It was revealed by the Bab in Arabic during his imprisonment in Maku and Shirik between 1847 and 1850. It is not to be confused with the Book of Names as mentioned in the Tablet of Carmel by Baha'u'llah. It is the largest revealed scripture in known religious history, comprising more than 3,000 pages. Some extracts are available in English in selections from the writings of the Bab. The text is divided in 19 unities and 361 gates. The book consists largely of lengthy variations of invocations of the names of God. Each name is discussed in 4 different parts, each part written in a different mode of revelation. We see here the parts are divine verses, the prayers, the commentaries, and rational arguments. And in general, this book of names counsels the Babis to remain unified until the promised one comes, not to let anything keep them from recognizing him, meaning Baha'u'llah, of course, and what their attitudes and behavior should be like when that promised one comes. The 361 chapters symbolizes all things. There's our word kulishe once again. And they symbolize each day of the Badí calendar. These explanations about many divine names and attributes describes how humanity can be spiritualized by recognizing the manifestation of God. So let's look at the actual names, beginning with the names of the days of the week. And I've got 3 sources here that you can look for a little bit more elucidation. So we have, and I'm not going to pronounce the Arabic name because I don't want to set an incorrect example for anyone listening. I'll just use the English translations that were provided. So we have the first day of the week is called Glory, and that is Saturday. Uh, this column here has additional meanings of the word that maybe give us a little better appreciation for the full extent of of what is meant, in this case by Jalal. So the next day is beauty, which is Sunday, on Sunday. The next is perfection, which is Monday, and grace is Tuesday, justice is Wednesday, majesty is Thursday, and then independence is Friday. Independence is the designated day of rest, although I am not aware that a Baha'i day of rest is observed anywhere in the world at this time. And so the next 3 slides will show us the names of the months. We should note, so I do have the month number in this first column. That can also be the day number of the month. So the 19 days of the month have the same names as the sequence of months. In the next column, I show what is the first day of that month, expressed in terms of days after Nowruz. And this is easy, right? We begin with 0 because that is Nowruz in month 1. And then just add 19 for each subsequent month. So we have the Arabic name and also an Arabic script and the English name, and then additional illumination of how else that same word has been translated in other places in Baha'i scripture. So for the month of Baha, the month of splendor, we have additional meanings of glory or light or excellence. And it's also the day or month, if it's the month of the year, which is in honor of Baha'u'llah. Our next month has the name glory, and then beauty, and then grandeur, and light, and mercy, and words. So I just mentioned too that when it comes to the Arabic representations that we are accustomed to seeing in the English translations, um, this is often a hybrid of Arabic and Persian. If it were strictly done exactly in accordance with the Arabic, so I'm told by my Arab-speaking friends, it might take a little different form. For example, Baha would have um, the what we would call the accent mark, or the like an apostrophe at the end, the hamza, and that in Arabic would be the more correct form. But we have Persians and Arabs uh, and writings in both languages, and so we tend to have a little bit of a hybridization between the two methods. So the next page shows a few more months, and we have perfection, names, might and will, knowledge, power, and speech. And you can see some additional ways that those words have been translated or rendered in various translations of Baha'i writings. And you see again how many days after Nowruz each of these is. And then the next and last page of these gives us questions. And actually, I'll pause here for a moment because questions has always given me a little pause to consider, how is that an attribute of God? And I think we get maybe a better feel for it as we look at these other translations of the word Masail that have appeared in the Baha'i writings. Principles, truths, matters, mysteries, subtleties, obscurities, intricacies, problems, objectives, propositions. And one of my scholarly friends said also you can think of it as to question. It's not just questions, but it's to question something. And that's a way that we um, get a deeper understanding of something. So I thought it's interesting. And I mention this just because there's many of us who, when we create a program for a feast and we have to select writings, we're inspired by the name of the month. And by looking at these additional meanings or additional ways it's been translated in Baha'i scripture, it might give us more inspiration for how we might select those readings if we want to stick to that idea. Of course, nothing says we need to do that, but it's um, nothing wrong with doing that. And I certainly personally enjoyed putting together feast programs in that way. But let's continue. So we have the Feast of Questions, or I should say the month of questions, and then the month of honor, and then sovereignty, and then dominion. And now we have a break in the calendar. So this is where we insert the days of Ha, the Ayamaha. So the first day of Ayamaha is 342 days after Nowruz. The final day of Ayamaha, though, we don't know until we compute the next actual Nowruz day, and then we can subtract 20 from that day, and that gives us the final day of Ayamaha. And then, and also, just very briefly, Ha has an abjad value of 5, which is the maximum number of days of Ha. And in note 3 from Summons of the Lord of Hosts, we're given a wonderful explanation of the symbolism of Ha. And in there, it symbolizes the word Hovia, which is the essence of divinity or the essence of God. And so the days of Ha celebrate the essence of God. And these are the days outside of time. And indeed, literally, they're days outside of our calendar, right? The calendar of 19 months times 19 days, and these are outside of that. So we have that literal meaning. And then there are numerous spiritual meanings that we can glean from reading related writings about this. But the one I like to think about is to consider the essence of divinity in that ultimate realm of God, the realm of Hahut. And in that realm, there is no time, there is no place, right? Everything to do with that realm is outside of time. And isn't that wonderful that these are the days out of time? And the essence of God is, of course, outside of time. And so it's just beautiful symbolism that we can think about. And this leads us to our very last month of loftiness, Allah, which is glory or loftiness. And it is a day, if it's the day of the month, then it's the day. But if it's the month, it's a whole month in honor of the Bab. And it is the month of fasting and the month of restraint. And we only know when this day will fall by computing the next Nowruz and subtracting 19 days. And that's the first day of that month. So we're almost complete. We do have one more to look at, which is the years of the 19-year cycle. And so this original presentation that I'm showing you right now, I worked out about a year ago, 13th of February. And so that day in the year 2021 could be expressed as the day Jalal, the day of the month Kamal, the month of Mulk, the year Vav, of the 10th Vahed, of the first Kulishay. Now that's a mouthful, or we could look at it as the simple date, it's Jalal, of the 8th of Mulk of the year 177 Baha'i era. That simpler form is probably the date form that we're all going to get used to in the future. So each year of the 19-year cycle is given a name by the Bab as well. And simply, I'll just read the English version of it. We have just the letter A, and the second year is the letter B, and the third is father, the fourth is D, the fifth is gate, the sixth is V, or in Arabic, that would be wow. Vav is a Persian rendering of that letter. The seventh is eternity, the eighth is generosity, and then splendor, then love, then delightful, then answer, then single, then bountiful, then affection, then beginning, luminous, most luminous, and finally unity. And so these are all the names for the days of the week, the days of the month or the months of the year, and then the years of the 19-year cycle. So now we turn our gaze to the holy days. So there are two classes of holy days, most of them during which work is forbidden, and then two that are associated with the life of Abdu'l-Baha, in which work is not suspended, and the observance of these days is not obligatory, whereas the other 9 holy days observance is obligatory. And so we have Nowruz, which of course is 0 days after Nowruz, right, by definition. It occurs on the 1st of Baha. We know it also as the festival of Nowruz and as the Day of God. The first day of Rizwan occurs on the 13th of Jalal, which is 31 days after Nowruz. We observe it at 3 p.m. Standard Time. If we happen to have daylight savings time, and a lot of the world does, then we would celebrate it compensating for that. So, for example, where I am here in the mountain time zone of the United States, that would be observed at 4 p.m. We have the 9th day of Rizwan, 39 days after Nowruz, but it's fixed on the 2nd of Jamal. By the way, these two are exactly saying the same thing, right? 2nd of Jamal is 39 days after Nowruz. So it's just two ways of expressing the same thing. And then we have the 12th day of Rizwan on the 5th of Jamal. We have the declaration of the Bab, which is also designated as a festival, observed 2 hours after sunset on the 8th of Azamat. We have the ascension of Baha'u'llah on the 13th of Azamat at 3 a.m. Standard Time, or adjusted if you're in daylight savings. We have the martyrdom of the Bab on the 17th of Rahmat, observed at noon Standard Time. The birth of the Bab on the first day after the 8th new moon after Nowruz, and we spoke at length about figuring out when that actually occurs. And then the day right after that is the birth of Baha'u'llah. So those two will float throughout about roughly a 30-day period of the year. So then the other 2 holy days where work is not suspended is the Day of the Covenant on the 4th of Qal, and the Ascension of Abdu'l-Baha on the 6th of Qal, observed at 1 a.m. You might recall from history the actual moment of ascension, if I'm not making a mistake, was actually 1:30, but the observance is designated for 1 a.m. Oh, and a note too on the festival of Rizwan, that the whole 12-day festival, the most great festival, or also known as the King of Festivals, is right. The duration of the whole festival is 12 days, but work is suspended only on the 1st and 9th and 12th days. So that's why they're called out specifically on this table. So perhaps just a brief thought on this excerpt from the message from the House of Justice. The adoption of a new calendar in each dispensation is a symbol of the power of divine revelation to reshape human perception of material, social, and spiritual reality. Through it, sacred moments are distinguished, humanity's place in time and space reimagined, and the rhythm of life recast. Now, I don't want to prolong this presentation too much by really going into this in a deep way, although it certainly deserves it. But we can consider, what does it mean to us? And when we look at the feast days, the first day of each month is dedicated to Baha'u'llah, right? It's the day Baha. And it's a day we can celebrate being together, right? This community of the most great name, these wonderful souls who have recognized Baha'u'llah as the manifestation of God for this day. We have the privilege of sharing this time with these people. And when we think of a day dedicated to Baha'u'llah, what do we think about? Maybe we think about the sacrifice he undertook for us, right? Giving up all his worldly things, being exiled from place to place, away from his beloved land of birth, and the terrible ordeals along the way, and right, just the uncountable episodes and magnitude of suffering that he endured. Does this not make us yearn to get together and attend feast? And then sprinkled throughout the year, we have joyous festivals, which we just talked about a little bit. And we have other holy days sprinkled through the year, some being, three being very sad, right? The ascension of Baha'u'llah, the martyrdom of the Bab, the ascension of Abdu'l-Baha, and a happy holy day, the Day of the Covenant. We have the fast and its month, which is dedicated to the Bab. And of course, when we think of the Bab, we think of the great sacrifices that he made. And we can ponder his life and how, since his public proclamation, he had so little time in freedom. And he was incarcerated in Maku and Sharik. And ultimately, right, and the sadness he witnessed with the persecution and slaughter of his faithful followers, and then ultimately his martyrdom. And so we might think about the sacrifice of the Bab during the day Allah, during each month of the year, and during the month of Allah, where we have our fast and our season of restraint. And then we have Nowruz, which is designated as the Day of God. It's the day Baha, of the month Baha. It's the start of the new year. It's the start of the month dedicated to Baha'u'llah. And what does this make us think about? And does it have anything to do with the traditional Persian Nowruz? Or is this completely recreated as something new? So, things to think about. So I'm going to quote a little bit from, actually, most of the paragraph 16 from the Katabi Akdas, where Baha'u'llah talks about Ayamaha. He writes, "O people of the world, we have enjoined upon you fasting during a brief period, and at its close have designated for you Nowruz as a feast. Thus have the day star of utterance shone forth above the horizon of the book, as decreed by him who is the Lord of the beginning and the end. Let the days in excess of the months be placed before the month of fasting. We have ordained that these, amid all nights and days, shall be the manifestations of the letter Ha, and thus they have not been bounded by the limits of the year and its months. It behooveth the people of Baha throughout these days to provide good cheer for themselves, their kindred, and beyond them, the poor and needy, and with joy and exultation to hail and glorify their Lord, to sing his praise and magnify his name. And when they end these days of giving that precede the season of restraint, let them enter upon the fast." The start of that quotation began, "O people of the world." So it's not only Baha'is who are told to observe the fast, it's the people of the world. And actually, we observe that many people, not only Baha'is, are observing the fast now. And perhaps we can consider how we can give to the needy, or perhaps those needing other kinds of assistance, to make it easier for them to get through the fast. And thanks to a friend who can read other languages other than my ignorant self who only has English, there's a tablet of Abdu'l-Baha that has not yet been translated that conveys that spirit of making it easier to get through the fast as um, something we should do during these days of Baha, of Ha. We're encouraged to celebrate the essence of God and his oneness during these days of Ha by showing love and fellowship and unity. It's not just a Baha'i replacement for Christmas, right? It's like, oh yeah, well, we're Baha'is, we give at a Yamaha, we don't give at Christmas time. It's much more than that. It's a time for charity, of goodwill, good cheer to ourself and to others, of service, of executing projects of a humanitarian nature. It's all these things. And then what does this phrase look like to us? With joy and exultation to hail and glorify their Lord, to sing his praise and magnify his name. So something else to ponder. So now, for those who are not of the faint of heart, we're going to have a look at technical details of the Earth's orbit around the sun, about the equinox, and details that we have to understand in order to compute the calendar. So first, let's look at understanding the guidance we've been provided. The festival of Nowruz falleth on the day that the sun entereth the sign of Aries. And the House of Justice clarified in the message we read at the beginning that it is the moment of the vernal equinox in the Northern Hemisphere. So of course, the Universal House of Justice is freed from error, and they're the source of all good. And so they say this, we know it's absolutely true. But if we look at the history of astronomy, we see that this idea of this first point of Aries, right, that when the sun entereth the sign of Aries, also known as the cusp of Aries, it has its origin in the year 130 before Christ. So it is the reference point used in celestial coordinate systems. So it's called the first point of Aries because at that year, it was in the western extreme of the constellation of Aries, near its border with Pisces and the star Mesarthim, or of Gamma Arietis. So due to the sun's apparent and relative eastward movement across the sky throughout the year, this western end of Aries was the point at which the sun entered the constellation. Hence, it was called the first point of Aries. And Aries, of course, is the ram. So astronomers acknowledge this term even today, even though there is a 25,772 year precession of the equinoxes. So today the equinox doesn't occur in Aries at all, it occurs in Pisces. And in about 700 years, it will be occurring in Aquarius. This axial precession is a gravity-induced, a slow and a continuous change in the orientation of the Earth's rotational axis, just like you would observe in a spinning top. That you see the top will start to wobble, and that axis will start to rotate. It'll have an inclination and it'll rotate, and then eventually that top will fall. So this gradually moves the equinoxes by 1 degree every 71.6 years. So at the bottom of this page, I have a couple of things you can go look at if you want just a little bit more detail, but I think I've captured the spirit of it here. And this is the constellation Aries, and you can see that star that we mentioned, Mesarthim. This image comes from universetoday.com. Thank you to them. So vernal equinox. Well, actually, I suppose I should start with defining equinox. So equinox means equal night, and that's the time when day and night split equally the day, right, the 24-hour day. So the actual vernal equinox occurs when the sun crosses from the south to the north pole of the celestial equator at the ascending node of the Earth's orbit, which is the ecliptic. And probably some of you have no idea what I just said. So let's look at the diagram. Okay, so here's the Earth. And there's a very faint little green line here that cuts across at an angle. That faint green line is actually the equator of the planet Earth. This axis is our axis of rotation, right? So normally when you see a map of the world or a globe, you would see this line straightened up to be straight up north, okay? So anyway, so this faint green equatorial line you can project on a big sphere outside of our, or that's, let's say, equal to our path around the sun, and call that the celestial equator. But the motion of the Earth follows the ecliptic, which is this other, um, here it's drawn in a circle on a sphere. It's in fact slightly elliptical, but let's not worry about that detail. But so as the Earth is rotating around the sun, then at this point, called the vernal equinox, we cross from below to above the celestial equator if we define north as above. So that's the point of vernal equinox. That's the point where day and night are equal in length, although in reality, the day is slightly longer due to refraction of light. And so even though the sun has physically set below the horizon, we actually, because of diffraction, we actually still see it for just a little while longer. And so we get an extra bonus couple of minutes of light. And that's true at sunrise and also at sunset. So, okay, the Earth continues around its journey, passes around the sun, which, what I'm tracing here, picture the sun at the center for while I'm tracing these orbits. And so the Earth is moving around the sun, and then we hit the autumnal equinox, where now the Earth is about to dip below the celestial equator, and which, right, you see it here, it's now above us. So that's the movement of the Earth around the sun. So, and that captures everything that I have in the text. The terminology, vernal equinox, is really northern hemisphere centric, right? It's the spring for us in the north. Of course, if you're in the southern hemisphere, it's not spring, it's fall. So the terminology is biased by the people who created it, which were people in the northern hemisphere. So I'm just giving you a larger view, because if you're viewing this on a small screen, some of that might have been pretty hard to look at. And here, if we see the Earth, maybe now you can better see the equator. That's the faint green line. If I were doing this drawing, I would have done the shading that follows the equator, not the shading to follow the projection of the ecliptic onto the Earth. I think that would have made it slightly more clear. But hey, I'm grateful someone did the drawing, because there's a bit of work that went into that, and we'll acknowledge the author. That's the attribution they asked to show if you use their diagram. Okay, so that explains the movement of the Earth. But now we still need to understand the rest of the guidance. And so this part where it says, even should this occur no more than 1 minute before sunset, what does that mean? Well, if the equinox occurs 60 or fewer seconds before sunset, then Nowruz falls on the next day. But should the equinox occur, let's say, for sake of argument, 61 seconds or even more before sunset, then Nowruz falls on the same day as the equinox. So we might ponder why Baha'u'llah added that clause into his definition. But I marvel over this situation. So as I was performing computations for the year 2026, this exact situation occurs. The vernal equinox occurs at 6:15 p.m. on the 20th of March, 2026 in Iranian Standard Time, and sunset that day is 6:16 p.m. So because of this clause, for that particular day, we set Nowruz to the 21st of March, because the equinox is no more than 1 minute before sunset. So the ad hoc committee of the Universal House of Justice, which was tasked with determining the dates within the new calendar, communicated with the organization that produced those tables and verified the numbers since this was so tight and it was right at the edge of that definition that Baha'u'llah gave. And so uh, I have to admit, when I encountered this problem and I had to communicate with the House of Justice for guidance and say, well, there's a ±1 minute error on the tables. And so the equinox might be before sunset, it might not be. And what do we do? And the House of Justice replied, of course, and said, well, it is. The nominal calculation is no more than 1 minute before sunset. Therefore, this is indeed on the next day, falls on the next day. And it just blew me away because in my little narcissistic mind, I felt like Baha'u'llah was speaking directly to me as I was making these computations. It just, wow, it was just mind-boggling. So I actually said this already, but the best available tables have an error of ±1 minute in these computations. That's true for the equinox, it's true for sunrise, sunset. And so, but it's the nominal values that are being used. Um, the tables are actually currently in revision. I understand from the website on which they appear that they hope to have them back online and revised by around the middle of this 2022. And so I'm just chomping at the bit, eager to redo the calculations and see if there's any changes as a result of the revision of these tables. Okay, so one more thing stands in our way of performing these calculations. That is, we have to determine where in the world is Tehran. So the House of Justice advised in, again, personal communications that the WGS84 model of the Earth is to be used. And they provided an additional website for standardized locations of cities on that WGS84 model. And so, great, that defines exactly where we use as a frame of reference. But out of curiosity, I looked at, if you just ask the question generally on the web, you get a number of different answers, right? What are the GPS coordinates of Tehran? You get more than one answer. And so I looked at putting all those places on a map of Tehran to see how much they differed from each other, and then to calculate and see, does that make any difference in the results? So here's one location that you get. And just from memory, I recall that another one was over here. Another one is over here. Hopefully you can see my pointer wiggling around. And for frame of reference, this is the location of the Sia Chal, right here where I'm wiggling. This is the location, actually this whole thing is Golistan Palace, which is where the Shah lived at the time Baha'u'llah and the Babis were incarcerated in the Sia Chal. And so you see these places are all really near uh, some of these locations, but none of them, the coordinate used for this is not specifically a Baha'i landmark. It's not the house of birth of Baha'u'llah. It's just a standardized representation of the city of Tehran. Okay, so now hopefully we understand the guidance. Now we know where to do the computations from. So now we have to do the computation. So we begin for the year 178 of the Baha'i era. The vernal equinox that begins the year is March 20th of 2021. It occurs at 1:07 p.m. Sunset for that day is, as it almost always is, at 6:16 p.m. So this places Nowruz on the day of the equinox, which is the 20th of March. And I note that Nowruz can occur either on March 19 or 20 or 21 by using this new methodology. So my curiosity got a hold of me, and I had to look at, when will Nowruz ever occur on March 19? So by my unofficial computation, I see that this occurs in the year 2092. I'm pretty unlikely to be alive that year to witness it for the first time. Maybe some of you really young people watching this recording will be around for it. It occurs again 4 years later in 2096, and then it doesn't occur again through to the year 2150, which is as far as I was able to do any computation. So again, I'll remind you, these are not official statements of anyone. This is just me personally being curious and whimsical and having a look to the future, which I won't be alive for. Okay, so we establish Nowruz. Now we need to examine the lunations, right? The times and occurrence of the new moon, so that we can establish which is the 8th new moon after Nowruz. So we have to figure out the time of the new moon and determine if it's before or after sunset, so that we place the new moon on the correct day. So by doing this, we find new moons on April 12, May 11, June 10, July 10, August 8, September 7, October 6, and then the 8th new moon is November 5th. It occurs at 45 minutes past midnight. So obviously the day of the new moon is November 5, because the day, November 5, according to the Baha'i reckoning, began after sunset on November 4, right? So it's smack in the, almost in the middle, not quite the middle of that day. So for this 8th new moon, um, we now establish it's November 5. And so then we can set birth of the Bab on November 6 and the birth of Baha'u'llah on November 7. Okay, but we're not done yet. So, oh, by the way, just I'm doing another segue. So I got curious if it could be possible to compute the exact range. What's the earliest and latest possible date for the birth of the Bab? And then again, this is unofficially my work, not checked by anyone else, but it appears that it's October 13 through November 14. And that's within Mashiach Ilm and Kodrat, of course, as the House of Justice expressed in the message we started with. And so this also made me think, this brilliant formula for the House of Justice, how did they come up with this? And so what can we see from the very first, I mean, from the real day that the birth, that the Bab was born and that Baha'u'llah was born? And so let's apply this methodology to those years. So if we do that, we find that Nowruz in 1817 and also in 1819 would have been on March 21st. So then we observe that Baha'u'llah was born 2 days after the 8th new moon after Nowruz of that year. Spectacular, right? And that was November 12, 1817, equivalent to the 2nd of Muharram of 1233 after Hijrah. We also observe 2 years later, roughly, that the Bab was born 1 day after the 8th new moon after Nowruz, October 20th of 1819, or the 1st of Muharram, 1235 AH. So this new method faithfully and consistently reflects the past. It preserves the lunar character of these 2 consecutive days, which are regarded in the sight of God as one, and places them on consecutive days within the Badí calendar aligned to the solar requirements. I'll tell you, I can't express how much awe I was in when I did these computations and found the formula works right up until even before the Baha'i era began. And the Bab was born 1 day after the 8th new moon after Nowruz, and Baha'u'llah 2 days after the 8th new moon after Nowruz. And that's the exact formula. Wow. Okay, so we're almost done. We still have one more thing to figure out. We need the date of the next Nowruz. Otherwise, we don't know when Ayamaha should end and the month of Allah should begin. So we compute this. We find that the equinox is in 2022 on March 20 at 7:03 p.m. and that sunset, like usual, is 6:16 p.m. Therefore, this places Nowruz on the 21st of March. And in turn, we subtract 19. That places the beginning of Allah on March 2nd. And then the day before that is the final day of a Yamaha on March 1st. So this makes a Yamaha range from, in the year 2022, February 25 to March 1st, which is 5 days duration. Even though the 2022 Gregorian calendar year has no leap day. That's why I found this would be a really great example to use. It's current for at least for now, and also it illustrates that point that the 5 days of Ha don't have to correspond to a Gregorian leap year. So now the rest is really easy. We just add days from Nowruz to determine the first day of each month and indeed the other holy days. Remember in those tables I provided, I had that column that said how many days after Nowruz would these things be. So this table here at the bottom of the page just puts all that on one page for you. And we just simply do that math and then we have our full calendar year. So we'll end by looking at the official dates that were provided by the beloved Universal House of Justice. So they promised that they would send to all national spiritual assemblies a table of that would cover 50 years. And so here is the table. And so it's not in the most pretty format because what I did to avoid any possibility of an error on my part, I used a snipping tool and I captured from the PDF file all of the things that you see pasted on this page. So there's no transcription error possible. So we see in this left set of columns, the Baha'i dates and Gregorian equivalent date for Nowruz. And in the center column, we see this for the births of the Bab and Baha'u'llah on those 2 consecutive days. And then in this last column, we see the the number of days that are intercalary, that is to say, the number of days of Ha for that particular year. And then what are the Gregorian dates that are equivalent? And I'll point out here before we move away, here's another lovely example for the year 2023, actually the Baha'i era year of 180. You see the days of Ha are from the 26th to the 29th of February. So that is a Gregorian leap year, but the Baha'i year only has the extra 4 days, not 5, right? So it's totally disconnected from Baha'i era year to the Gregorian year. And this other snippet here just continues. I ran out of room on the page to put it in a reasonable large font size. And this last page is looking at all of the other Baha'i dates for the years. And so we have, we can express that with a Gregorian equivalent with just looking at if Nowruz occurs on March 20 that year. And if so, then these are all the dates that ensue. Or if it's March 21st of that year, these are the dates that ensue. So you notice that there's no column for March 19, and that is because in this 50-year time span, it never happens. So we can, if you're very young right now and have a good long life, you will see one day there'll be a version of this that shows March 19 on it as to give a Gregorian date reference. And so, dear friends, this is everything I could think of to share with you. This is the first of hopefully many public videos that I'll be posting here at my YouTube channel. So you can subscribe if you wish at that link. And please feel free to leave comments. Be nice, but feel free to leave comments. If you think I've made a mistake somewhere, please share that. If you have anything else to say, please share that. And any other questions, I'll try to respond in a reasonable manner. And this is the end of our presentation today. So thanks very much for tuning in, and stay safe, stay well, stay happy. And I look forward to being able to present other things for you in the future. All right, take care, everyone.